Are you insane, Richie? Fitting Mod 1 gearing to the WLTOYS 124019? Well, the good news is I'm going to show you step by step in this video how to very easily fit Mod 1 gearing to the 124019. Well, why would you want to fit Mod 1 gearing? Well, the stock gears are pretty good. I've pushed one of these up to 104 miles an hour on 3S with the stock gearing. To go faster, I need to change the ratio. I can't do that easily with the stock gears. It's not as simple as changing out our Traxxas or an Armour, nothing like that. But if you, like me, fit Mod 1 gears to your car, you're going to be able to put just about any gear ratio you want into this car. Will this car reach 120 with Mod 1 on or not? Well, we shall see. But as I'm smiling so hard, it might give you a good indication that I know what's coming. Anyway, let's get straight down to it. Well, first of all, we're going to need to remove this central spine. It's held on by 8 screws, 2 here, 2 here, 2 here, and 2 at the front now. We're also going to need to remove these 2 screws, but more on that in a second. My tip of the day, when it comes to removing these screws, use a conventional screwdriver to loosen them before you use a power driver, as the metal is only quite soft and you will strip the heads if not. With those 8 screws removed, put the central spine to one side. Now to get the motor out, but we're going to change this over to brushless at the same time. Remove this little piece of plastic, but if you are reusing the same motor mount, then you're definitely going to keep hold of this. Next, you're going to want to apply some heat with a soldering iron to these 2 screws that will loosen the thread lock, and that should enable you to remove these 2 screws a little more easily. With those 2 screws out of the way, the motor should remove fairly easily, although I do need to clean it. Now while I remove the motor, you might think, God, that looks terribly messy, Rich, and there is also a lot of gunk on the bottom here. You might want to consider putting that back on if you're keeping the stock motor, because it's heat sink compound. It enables the heat from the motor to dissipate out naturally through the chassis. Absolute genius if I ever thought that up at WLTOYS. So next job, remove the central drive shaft in order we can fit our Mod 1 gearing. That will also enable us to remove this plastic gear cover, which is going to become unnecessary. First of all, we're going to need to remove these 2 screws on the steering to remove this bar. More on that in just a second. You've got 6 screws holding the diff covers on. There are 2 located at the back, 2 here, 2 here. So 6 on this end and the same at the other end. 2 here, 2 here, and 2 tucked away down in here. Well, at the front now, if I undone this side, loosen this side, just be aware if you take either one or both of these screws out, that you've got that little white spacer in there. Lose that at your peril, because that holds and keeps the steering tight. Without it, the thing will just flop around like that. And I would just say on the back 2 screws and on the front 2 screws here, while you could just loosen them off, I would be tempted to remove them entirely, because if you haven't loosened the screws back off enough, when you lean the diff cover back, it will snap at the back. So I'd recommend completely removing all 6 screws at each end. And to get access to those front 2 screws, you're also going to find it much easier if you remove the tops of the front shocks. You can also use that time to check the oil level in the shocks. Now, as you'll see, when I've released all 6 screws at the back there, the top of the suspension has pushed the back gear away anyway. So we're going to lean that forwards, get that clear at the back. At the same time, we're going to lean the front forwards, and we've now removed our drive shaft, ready to fit Mod 1 gearing. Also, when you've got the motor and the drive shaft assembly out of the way, loosen the 2 screws and remove this mount. Now on this car, people say check the diffs. On the one that ran 104 miles an hour, I not actually checked the diffs, but I have on this one. And on this one, there was virtually no grease in there, so I have taken the time to take it apart, put some grease in. Suggest you do likewise. Well, with the drive shaft removed, you're going to need to get a measure. Using my metal rule here, I'm going to measure from this face to the back edge of this gear. If you look on here, that is 15 millimeters, or maybe 14 and a half on that. Make a careful note of that. The one thing I would say is measure your gear, because yours might be a millimeter or 2 different from mine on that spacing, and that spacing is absolutely crucial. Next thing to do is to remove this gear and these 2 bearings. You're wondering, how do I do that, Rich? There's no little hole on the side or anything on there. There is, however, underneath this grease, a tiny little grub screw on there which you're going to need to remove. And if you're wondering what size hex to use, that's a 1mm one. 1.5 didn't seem to fit in when I tried it. You need to grip the gear, making sure that's nice and tight in there. Like I said, if it won't move, apply heat to this. Do not try and force it, because if you strip that screw, you ain't going to be doing this conversion. So time to remove that screw. Well, with the grub screw removed, you can now remove the gear and the 2 bearings. And with some wiggling and jiggling, it simply pulls away. It's quite stiff to start with, and then it just suddenly falls loose on that. Whether everyone will be the same as that, I'm not quite sure. Now we are in a position to simply remove our existing spur gear. You'll note this gear has got a bearing attached to the outside of it. I'm going to address that later on in the video. You're going to need quite a stiff pull to get that off because it's quite stiff on the shaft. So what mod gear do you want to fit? Well, obviously that depends on how fast you want to go. As an example, we've got a 34 tooth mod 1 gear on here, which is just slightly under the size of the existing spur gear. And we have a 25 tooth mod 1 gear, which is considerably smaller than existing spur gear. Now, whilst the two gears I just showed you are traditionally used as mod 1 pinions, in this instance they're big enough to use as mod 1 spurs. Now, when fitting your mod 1 gear, you do not want to fit the collar facing towards the back of the car because that's going to cause fouling issues at the back. You want it to go on that way. You may be wondering why I have ground this down. I've not. There is actually just some thread lock on here, and the easiest way to get it off, the easiest and fastest way to get it off was just to literally use the grinder, and now the gear goes on there without any problem. But I've not ground the shaft down in any way. It's purely to get that excess thread lock off. Now, how far down do we need to move this? Well, in order to establish that, we're simply going to take the gear that goes on the end of the shaft, put that back on, tighten the grub screw to fix it back in place. When you're tightening it up, simply grip the flat spot on the shaft and use your hex key on there. Nice and simple. So exactly where does that gear need to be on the shaft? Remember that 15mm at the start I measured right at the very start? Simply measure out 15mm on here. Tighten your grub screw up on your gear to lock that in place, and that's our mod 1 conversion. More than halfway to being done. And at this point, I would strongly recommend the use of blue thread lock on here because this job, whilst easy to do, you don't want this coming apart. Okay, double check before you finish putting it all together and tightening that up one last time that measurement there is exactly the same one as you started out with. I mentioned that bearing fitted to the original spur gear. You will see the issue you potentially have is if that was in the same place, that bearing is roughly where this collar is. Now, what does that mean in reality, Richie? Well, if you use the mount that I have got, that means that is a very tight fit indeed around there. You can see on that. I personally am going to use my Dremel to machine a little bit out of this mount. The other way around that is to simply use a conventional mount. Then you don't have any issues at all with anything catching on your mod 1 collar. So you have options when it comes to addressing that collar issue. Now to put the drive shaft back in. First of all, I'm going to put the front end in, then the rear end. You will notice there's two bearings at either end of the car. There is also a little spacer in each of these differentials at the rear and at the front as well. So to line those back up with that plastic spacer, maybe get a little screwdriver, something like this, line them up, that goes down in place. Personally, I'm now going to put a couple of screws to hold that front diff back in place while I get to the rear one. Now for the minute, I've just put two screws in the front there to hold everything back down. Pay attention, make sure your drive shafts are back in there. That's one of the reasons why I put two screws in. You put all six back in, you've got the drive shaft out, you've got to take the whole thing apart again. Now, as you'll see on the rear there, that the bearings are set between the spacer on there, so that is good to go back on as well. Now, when you're doing the back, also just put two screws in there. Reason for this is this. Just check everything is working right on the car and turning correctly on there, both at the front and at the rear, that you've not got any issues of grinding. Now I've not got any issues, time to put all the screws back in. Well, quick Richie, a moment. The one thing I would say, when checking the car's working, you're putting it all back together, everything is now moving freely. Don't do as I do. Initially, I had actually gone and put the two screws back in here as opposed to in the side holes in here. If you put the screws in those two holes as opposed to those two, then the transmission is locked absolutely solidly. But now we can run in anger. Well, we're nearly all back together. Before I talk about motor mounts and gear ratios, time to fasten these front two screws back down. The one thing I would say is make sure you pay careful attention. Fit that spacer in from underneath. Otherwise, the slop, the wiggle in the steering in here will be life-changing. Now at this point, people may ask me, what gear ratios are you going to run, Richie? What ratios should I run? Well, so much of that is down to the motor and the ESC you are using and the anticipated speed that you want to go at. So it's definitely going to be a personal choice. Now as for the motor mount, I prefer to use the solid aluminum ones, but a little bit more care needs to be taken when choosing the gears because it has got a fixed position for the motor to go in, unlike a conventional mount. So it's very strong, but needs a little bit more thought in terms of gear ratios. Now I will say the combined tooth count for the two gears needs to be around about 55 tooth or thereabouts. However, you could fit a conventional gear mount to the back of the car, but you're going to have to drill some holes in the back in order to do that, and it's going to be a little trickier to actually fasten the motor in place due to the access from the back. So there we have it. Now you know exactly how to fit Mod 1 gearing to a WLTOYS 124019. You can do the same on the 144001 or the 124018. But do remember to measure that spacing on the gear at the back, because that is absolutely essential in putting this all back together and it working correctly. So what's yours truly up to next for this car? Well, I'm fitting all these goodies, including that 3.5 turn brushless motor, in that box. So if you don't want to miss this thing doing its speed run, which should be well into 3 figures, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And I would just say, if you like the Mod 1 gearing conversion I'm about to show you, then don't forget to share it with friends. Well, thumbs up if you like this video, guys. Post any comments you might have in the comment section below the video and hit the circle below to subscribe. And if you do hit the circle, don't forget to hit the bell.